And we can hit start webinar. We're good, Marcy, Kris, Jeremy? I see everyone. Okay, good luck.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jeremy Hess. I'm faculty here at the University of Washington in emergency medicine, global health, and environmental and occupational health sciences. I'm also the director of the Center for Health and the Global Environment. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar highlighting the most recent IPCC assessment report, and in particular, the release of the impacts and adaptation aspect of that report. We have gathered here today a collection of authors, many of whom are affiliated with UW, but not all, who have worked on different aspects of climate change and health in the report. And we're going to tell you a little bit about the process and the major findings, and then have some lively discussion. Before we start, I want to make a few plugs. I want to let everyone on the call know about CHanGE and what we do, and encourage you to become a member. We're a member organization. We offer membership to students, staff, faculty, interested community members. You certainly can join if you're part of UW, but you don't have to be. We are quite inclusive with a very low barrier to entry. And we're eager to come together as a community to think about all aspects of climate change and health, from research to practice. We have a website. That's the easiest way to join. We won't harass you. We will provide you with opportunities for fellowship and scholarship, and we look forward to working with you in the future. I want to say a few thanks. First, to all of you for joining and for your interest in climate and health, and your concern about these topics and your action around these issues. I also want to thank our program manager, Marcy Burden, for her help coordinating this event and with everything else that she does. I want to thank Earth Lab, and in particular the Earth Lab staff, Constance McBaron and Ali Lang, who also helped us organize this. We're forever grateful. And then I want to thank all of our presenters, and also to note that Dr. Karen Levy is another UW professor who wasn't able to join us today because she's doing field work in Ecuador, but she also made significant contributions to the report in the key risks section. So we'll do our best to telegraph her contributions during the call. So I'm going to transition over now to Dr. Kristie Ebi. Dr. Ebi is the CHanGE founding director and has long and varied expertise and experience with the IPCC, and she's going to moderate our panel. Take it away, Kris.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And I want to make sure we also add our thanks to Kris Boyer, a PhD student who was our chapter scientist. They're unsung heroes. They do an amazing amount of work for no recognition, but we should recognize all the great work that Kris did. And I'm very much looking forward to the panel. We're going to start with Gueladio Cisse, who's going to talk a little bit about infectious diseases. We'd like each of the panelists to introduce yourself briefly and give maybe 5 minutes on what you think some of the key findings are in relation to your particular areas of expertise, or where you engaged with the report. Gueladio, thank you so much for joining so late at night. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Let me start first by introducing myself. So my name is Gueladio Cisse. I'm originally from Mauritania, West Africa. I'm working now at Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute, an associated institute of the University of Basel. And I'm working in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health, leading the research unit on ecosystem health sciences. And we are working on water issues connected to climate change and environmental health in general. So in this report, I had the honor to be coordinating lead author with my colleague Robert McLeman in Canada. And the chapter was on health, well-being, and changing structure of communities. And to talk about one section of it, infectious diseases. As you all know, it's a category of disease that is really, how can I say, variable for developing countries, and where you have a lot of poverty, a lot of deficiencies with water, sanitation, and poor settlement. So it's a large category of diseases worldwide. So there are three major categories among that group. We used to say waterborne diseases, vector-borne diseases, and foodborne diseases. There are respiratory infections also, and many other things, but mainly in the group of climate-sensitive diseases, there are the major categories of diseases we use to look at. And the literature is also mostly abundant on those categories. So the report looked at these climate-sensitive diseases under two lenses. The first one is what the literature succeeded to show as observed impacts. It's where we find a lot of literature and assessment about it. And then the second lens used to assess the risks, it's what kind of studies have been able to undertake some projections, considering some scenarios and some global warming levels. It's where we are less literature, but some diseases have very strong assessments. So with regard to observed impacts, compared to R5, there is a growing evidence that for some species of vector-borne diseases, if I stick to I start with the vector-borne disease now, malaria and dengue received a lot of attention, a lot of evidence. And for malaria, it's mostly how it was observed a kind of shift in the geographical areas, and also some increase in high altitudes in some places, particularly in Africa. And for dengue, it's a disease that used to be mostly in Asia, but the literature is showing that in urban contexts and in many other places in the world, the mosquito that is transmitting it is showing a very large expansion. There are some other vector-borne diseases that have been assessed, like Lyme diseases or some other mosquito transmissible diseases. With regard to waterborne diseases, diarrheal diseases, despite the fact that it's globally decreasing, the burden is decreasing globally, there are still some outbreaks or some occurrences that are linked to climate condition and weather condition. And this has been extensively documented. And example, cholera outbreaks have been associated with a number of climate change extreme events, climate extreme events. For foodborne diseases, one would highlight the risk associated with salmonellosis and campylobacter, and all these kind of these are linked to also climate extreme events. So these are, for the three categories, the major diseases that have been documented in the report. And for the projection, there are some projection for diarrheal diseases, and the projections are pointing to some regions like Africa and Asia, where some increased, how can I say, number of deaths associated to diarrheal diseases are projected in Asia and Africa. And for vector-borne diseases, the most worryable disease or risk is associated to dengue. Dengue projections are strongly convergent that in the near term and even the long term, if adaptation is not successful or just made consistently, we will face an increase of dengue risks in several regions in the world. So just as an introduction, I will stop here, looking forward to some questions. So these are the three major categories in infectious diseases with some examples of specific disease that was at the level of observed impacts already. And for the projections, where it has been possible by some teams to undertake solid projections, these are the areas of major concerns that have been highlighted in the report. I will end up with a last additional point when we talk about infectious diseases. This is the COVID-19 occurrence. It's also have been covered by a cross-chapter box in the chapter following the categories related to infectious diseases. As a shock, it has been illustrative of what the human societies are going to be facing because the climate is impacting on ecosystems. And these ecosystems also are playing a role on the vectors, on the transmission pathways, on the interaction between humans and animals, or humans and the ecosystems in general. And the COVID has illustrated how these risks are compounding, are putting further difficulties for adaptation. And because the outbreak didn't stop the impacts of the impacts of climate change on the disease in general, and didn't reduce the occurrence of extreme events that are also again coming as a compounding factor on the risk brought by infectious diseases. So I will stop here, and I look forward for any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate, Gueladio, you giving such a great introduction to some of the messages in the report on infectious diseases. We'll move from primarily tropical and some temperate regions up to the Arctic and hear from Sherilee Harper, who was a lead author on the North America chapter. Sherilee, floor is yours.
Thanks so much. It's such a great pleasure to be here today to talk about the report. The North American chapter, but also the cross-chapter paper on polar regions covered some things that are happening in the Arctic. So yeah, Gueladio provided a great overview of what's happening globally, and now I'd like to move to the Arctic. So I'm a Canada Research Chair in Climate Change and Health at the University of Alberta in Canada. And here are some of the high messages that come out of the Arctic in the context of health, and mainly around the social and environmental determinants of health. So our report really shows that some of the greatest magnitude and pace of climate change impacts in the world are clearly happening already in the Arctic. And the report shows how these impacts on ecosystems and societies that are projected for the future in other places of the world are actually already occurring in some places in the Arctic. So with some of these, greatest impacts of climate change that we've seen of our time to date, these impacts will continue under all levels of warming into the future. And the report really shows how climate change will make the Arctic look and feel very, very differently by 2050. So for the Arctic, these impacts have included things like impacts to the economy, to food systems, to water security and infrastructure. And of course, what really stands out to me is how all of these things have already impacted the physical and mental health of the people who live there. And the report makes it clear that climate change increasingly threatens many facets of Arctic livelihoods, culture, and identity, and health. And it really focuses on how it's already increased the risks of injury, food insecurity, and foodborne and waterborne disease. But in particular, a really new and important advancement in this report overall is a focus on global health globally, including in the Arctic region. Another key finding that comes from the Arctic regions is related to nutrition. So climate change impacts in the polar regions have already had important implications for the entire world, including how the contractions of the polar climate zones have led to changes in fisheries, which not only impact local food security for people who live in the Arctic, but it also threatens global dependence on polar regions for subsistence marine food production everywhere. And without limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, these key risks in North America and in the Arctic, the circumpolar Arctic, are expected to intensify by mid-century. And these risks will really could result in irreversible changes to the ecosystems, including damages to infrastructure and housing, stress on economic sectors, disruptions to livelihoods, mental health, and physical health and safety. In fact, in the polar cross-chapter paper, we highlight how there's some places in the Arctic that this has already happened. So for instance, we show places where permafrost thaw, sea level rise, and reduced sea ice protection has already damaged or destroyed some infrastructure, as well as many cultural heritage sites in the Arctic. And this will continue throughout the century. And this has really critical implications for mental and spiritual health, especially for Indigenous people. But it also has really important implications for health service provision and delivery for anyone who lives in the Arctic. And the report shows how climate change has not only impacted many facets of Arctic environments and society, but it also really underscores the urgent need for adaptation and that needs to be better supported. And for Indigenous peoples, who make up a significant portion of people who live in the Arctic, Indigenous self-determination in adaptation action is really critical to achieve a resilient and equitable future. And this brings me to, I think, a really important advancement in this report. For the first time, the IPCC report explicitly and specifically addresses the role of colonialism in climate change vulnerability in the Arctic. And we provide evidence on how colonialism not only hinders adaptation, but it also actually increases risk. And that means that to effectively respond to some of these climate change impacts on health in the Arctic, it also requires colonialism to be addressed. So I think I'll leave it there and just end by emphasizing that the report really calls for a need for urgent action within and outside of the health sector, in the Arctic, but also globally, and also really shows that every decision we make today can really take us closer to or further away from a climate resilient future. Thanks.
Thank you, Sherry. That was great. Really appreciate it. We're now going to move to Anna Vicedo, who is another person joining at midnight from Europe. We really appreciate you staying up so late to do this. I understand you've got a munchkin that does keep you up occasionally at these hours, and we appreciate you coming in to talk with us a bit about heat and your role in the report. So take it away, Anna.
Thanks a lot, Kris. And of course, thanks for letting me basically participate in this panel. I really appreciate the opportunity, and in a way, as kind of new person in this IPCC world, it's definitely an opportunity to contribute to these follow-up activities. And well, I will start just in a way introducing myself. I'm Ana Maria Vicedo-Cabrera. I'm an environmental epidemiologist. I work as, let's say, as early career researcher at the Institute of Social and Preventive Medicine of the University of Bern. I'm also part of the Oshger Center for Climate Change Research of the University of Bern. And yeah, basically I'm leading a small team on climate change and health. And let's say that during, I would say, about 10 years, my research has been mostly around the topic of temperature-related health impacts, ranging from mortality, morbidity, or let's say also for historical assessments, projections, and other modeling studies. And it was basically in a way, my small contribution to this report. But before going into the topic, I just want to personally express my gratitude to all the contributors to this report, because myself, my part was very, very small. compared to the whole report. And I know the burden that this implies in terms of work and time and discussion chats and so on. And I can imagine what really for the other people really leading chapters, this might have, it might have been basically. So let's say going into the topic, and it's basically heat. My contribution was mostly on the part on the key risk on the chapter 16 on key risk for health, and let's say my small book contribution was on heat-related mortality. But in a way here, I just want to, I think it's important to say that both parts were very much aligned, and what it was mentioned in the key risk part, it was very much reflected in the health part, vice versa. So basically, I think, in my opinion, the report once again confirms that heat is an important driver of disease burden today. And more importantly, we expect that this burden will very much amplify in the coming decades as warming progresses. And this is one key thing that I believe it's important because, again, evidence that is going out there every month about studies, regional studies, global studies are again pointing towards the substantial, let's say, impacts that are associated to the exposure to heat or heat waves. And most regions of the world, and at some point, I think this is important to reinforce again that there's a clear common direction. But at the same time, I think this report as well includes novel evidence that has been in a way released during the last years, mostly towards the role of climate change in the observed heat-related deaths, what it's basically distribution studies. And we, in this report, it's provided some clear estimations of what has been the contribution of human-induced climate change to the observed heat-related deaths happening during the last years at global and also for specific heat events that had happened in the past. And I think again this evidence is very important to, in a way, confirm that if we believe in the studies in terms of projections and so on, this trend will continue. We don't do anything about it. Another key finding, or something that I think is very well stated in the report, is this synergistic effect with current societal challenges, in the sense that it's expected that this burden of heat-related mortality and morbidity that we observe today will exacerbate in the future, not only because of the climate, the progressive, let's say, warming of the climate, but also because population will change and also the environment will change and eventually will act synergistically and will again, let's say, cause much more, let's say, impacts. I'm saying, for example, urbanization, because we know that it's from one side, Euro-Italian effect, that it's, let's say, it acts as an hazard amplification. And on the other side, the aging of the population, because we believe today that elderly are, let's say, amongst the groups that are more vulnerable to heat-related mortality and also morbidity. And something as well that is also very important is the idea of inequalities. We have seen that when we talk about heat-related mortality or morbidity, it's also about inequalities, both in exposure, vulnerability. So I think the report in this sense really clearly try to show the complexity of the topic, thinking that we have to, if we want to deal with the problem, it should be a more holistic approach, thinking that it's not only about heat, it's all the population, all the adaptation strategies, everything that could help to adapt or, let's say, reduce our vulnerability, and at the same time tackle existing societal challenges that are very relevant for other, let's say, issues. And something that I also want to highlight I think as well, although research around heat has been already for several years, there's substantive evidence really showing this, the relevance of the hazard. The report also towards existing gaps in knowledge, And I think as well as researchers, we have to, let's say, consider these gaps and put it, let's say, kind of targets of our research for next reports. Because, for example, the idea of impacts, we know that most of the impacts today, the heat-related mortality and morbidity are existing only in developed countries. And there's a clear gap of evidence what is happening in developing countries, such as Africa and parts in Asia, that we believe that are amongst the most affected today, but we don't have quantitative evidence to kind of support and also provide some guidance to policymakers to move forward. And at the same time, I think it's important to say that other potential, let's say, complexities towards this idea of compounding events, because we know what when heat happens, there are other environmental hazards happening at the same time, saying high air pollution levels, droughts, wildfires, etc., that eventually creates a kind of a more complex, let's say, situation to really understand or disentangle impacts. And eventually we know that these compounding events will also amplify in the future. And I think it's mostly what I would like to say. And I hope that, in the questions and so on, we can still continue in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was really, really helpful. And we're going to move on from heat to talking about food security and undernutrition. We've got two faculty from the University of Washington. We're going to hear first from Yona Sipos, and then we're going to hear from Jen Otten. And Yona, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kris. And I'm really feeling honored to be on this panel with these scientists. So many great scientists contributed to this wealth of a report. And I just have a few comments to help frame food systems and climate change, and particularly around the future considerations for our diets. So my name is Yona Sipos. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an assistant teaching professor in the Food Systems, Nutrition, and Health program at the School of Public Health at the University of Washington in Seattle. I live and I work in Seattle, which is on the traditional territory, including the land and waterways of Coast Salish nations and tribes who are still here. And I really appreciate both the point that was raised earlier and a strong sentiment that came through in the report that the future really is Indigenous in so many ways, that there really is an opportunity and an urgency around embracing different ways of knowing and honoring the age-old, millennial-old experiences of the Indigenous communities around the world. I teach and conduct research primarily at community and regional scales, and I focus on community-engaged scholarships, working toward food justice and food sovereignty. For the IPCC report, I contributed to Chapter 7, as many of us did, and specifically in a small way to the section on climate change, diets, and health. And so most of my remarks will be focused there, but I'll also just make a few remarks about some of the main messages that I've gotten out of the report. So first of all, the report presents so much evidence, of course, that climate change is unfolding rapidly and in the present time, and indicates that there are so many growing impacts on every aspect of lives around the world. So in particular, I'll note that the report emphasizes multiple links between food and the climate crisis, and this is happening in every region and in every community. Food systems are woven throughout the report, and so there's a real emphasis on the ecological underpinnings of food systems within Chapter 5, and then on the health implications within Chapter 7. But I think I read that the food systems are mentioned 350 times in the report, and I was quite impressed with that. Not surprised though, because of course food systems both contribute to climate change in a multitude of ways and then are in fact impacted in a multitude of ways. And so what do we mean by food systems, right? It's easy for us to think about food, but what do we mean by food systems? And it really is the description of the interconnected systems and processes and actors that influence nutrition, food, health, community development, agriculture, and then equity across the domains of food production, food distribution, food access, and ultimately food resource recovery or waste management. So While my contribution to the report focused on the impacts of climate change on diets and health, it's really important to recognize that our diets are one of many, many outcomes from our food systems that also impact our health, broadly speaking. So our public health, our population health, occupational health, environmental and ecological health, and even our economic health as well. So the report, I think, does a really strong job at laying the foundation of planetary health and ecosystem integrity that enables society, economics, and public health through this interdependence of climate, biodiversity, and people. And really, it's probably mostly people who are interdependent on biodiversity and climate and not the other way around. And so really seeing an opportunity for us to perceive ourselves as part of embedded systems, perceive societies as really only being able to survive and thrive within our ecological limits. And I think the report does a strong job of laying that out, and to also to be able to grapple with food systems at all these different, throughout the food supply chain and at all these different levels of the socio-ecological model. Climate change is impacting all of the domains of society, economics, public health, and environmental health. And one of the major findings of this report that stood out for me is that there is an even more urgent need than previously thought to improve livability, including by prioritizing equity and justice while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So throughout the report, including with food systems, there's an acknowledgement that the impacts are inequitable, they are inequitably felt and experienced, and that the adaptations have to be regionally specific and have to come from the people who in many cases are most impacted by these impacts. So this combination of improving livability, prioritizing equity and justice, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions is really an intersectional approach that can lead to better outcomes. And of course, we need better outcomes. And so this report really couples the deep dive into the urgent implications of climate impacts with the urgency around the kind of now what, so it lays out the what and so what of climate change in great detail. And then really the urgency is around the now what. So what do we do to adapt to these urgent issues facing us? So first, from the what and so what perspective, from a human health perspective, there's a really high confidence that climate change will further limit equitable access to affordable, culturally appropriate, and healthy diets. And we know that those diets will be less available, less accessible, less relevant, and less nutrient dense due to climate impacts. We're already seeing the evidence that climate change disrupts agricultural production and regional food availability. We've seen that through events even close to home here in Seattle with a massive heat wave last summer, where there was that has disrupted the shellfish industry, parts of the tree fruit industry, but also other agricultural sectors, including occupational health of farm workers who labor in the heat, including availability of food products, and including the rising price of foods, which are now being further exacerbated also by COVID and emerging global politics. So this is all happening locally for each of us, no matter where we are in the world, but it's also happening globally. And what this report lays out is also an anticipation of what will happen with, if we're able to stay to 1.5 degrees, but also what will happen with regional variation of temperatures. For example, regional variations of up to 2 or 3 degrees can lead potentially to 30 to 50% of food system labor, farm worker labor being impacted, reducing the labor capacity, increasing food prices, and increasing global welfare loss. We know that climate change is affecting the composition of diets in a multitude of ways, and through that, having major consequences for health. There are disruptions to the ecological and social systems that are already disproportionately experienced by low-income countries and communities, leading to more connections between climate change and increasing food insecurity. And food security is a concept that's probably familiar to most of us, but as the FAO defines it, it's a situation where all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious foods that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So food security requires availability of and access to a stable supply of food that can be used, and climate-driven impacts every single one of those domains: availability, accessibility, stability, and utilization. So just a couple of examples of how climate change will reduce food production
Yona?
potential.
I hate to interrupt. This is just really, really informative. With 3 more speakers.
Of course, yes.
So
And
sorry, it was great material.
That's okay. And I'll just leave it to say that I'm excited to talk about the adaptations and the transformations that are possible as well. And I'll pass it over to Jen.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I'll try to adapt mine based on what Yona presented, which crisscrossed a lot with my materials. So my name is Jen Otten, and I'm an associate professor and food systems director here at the University of Washington School of Public Health, as both Kris and Yona mentioned. And I want to talk a little bit about, I was sort of ticking off a little bit about what's new in the report, maybe from the AR5 to the AR6. My contribution to the report, sorry, Kris, was also very small, as others have talked about. I really focused on some food security and malnutrition sections at the request of Kris, and I'm also very impressed with how everyone wove all of this material together. But a couple of things I want to highlight that I think are really impressive, jumping just from AR5 and some of the special reports to this particular report, and those are that there's a lot of new research out there around the heterogeneity of effects, and you heard that in some of the former speakers. There is a greater attempt to incorporate research that looks at upstream factors, and in particular socioeconomic factors related to how some of these impacts will be experienced by different populations, and that is also particular to food nutrition as well. In terms of food nutrition, there is some coverage around livelihoods. So you can read the report and get a sense of how those whose jobs are related to food nutrition in some way, people who work in fishing or tourism or agriculture, or indigenous populations who are related to food, work that's related to food nutrition will be differently impacted. So I think that's something new in this particular report. And then the other thing that the food security and malnutrition sections tend to do is go beyond undernutrition. So in prior reports, the focus has been really squarely on undernutrition, and this one really expands to overnutrition and thinks about diet diversity differently. So it's not just thinking about how much, it's not just thinking about food availability, it's also going into those other domains of food security, like Yona was mentioning, around food access and food utilization and stability. So it's bringing together all of those socioeconomic factors and whatnot. And then in particular, one of the things I wanted to highlight that I really appreciated in this report was there's even greater integration, or there's even greater focus on solutions that really integrate multiple sectors. And there's an emphasis that, we really need to work together in order to solve these problems. We can't stay in our silos anymore. And so all of that really came together when I was, and I'm sort of jumping around a little because I'm trying to adapt to what Yona was talking about. But I think the 3 key points for me when it comes to food security and nutrition, one is, as Yona was talking about, we already know that climate change is causing widespread disruption in food production and food security, and across all of those food security domains. And she talked about some of the ways that that's happening. This report talks about how those risks to food security and malnutrition will escalate quickly and differently depending on different temperature scenarios, and may even cause irreversible impacts to people, to species, and to ecosystems. But I think the focus I want to take, or where I want to go to, is sort of that adaptation is crucial. And there are some solutions that exist, and we need more of these solutions. But one of the things that I really appreciated about this report was that there was more emphasis on some of the social protection programs that we might consider that can help improve equity, or help vulnerable communities adapt in terms of food security and malnutrition. So and there was a real emphasis on incorporating human rights based approaches into food systems to recognize that people have the right to well-being, and that's a real focus of this chapter. So I'm going to stop there because I have many more comments, but I'm going to pass it on to Jeremy and Kris because I think the rest might come up in Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was great. Jeremy, want to talk about mitigation and health co-benefits?
Indeed. Thanks, Kris. So again, for those of you who joined after the intro, I'm Jeremy Hess. I'm a professor of emergency medicine, environmental occupational health sciences, and global health here at University of Washington. My role in this report was as a lead author on chapter 7, which is focused on human health and human security. I also worked on chapter 16 on the chapter on key risks, on the portion of that chapter that focused on health. And one of the things that I worked on in our health and human security chapter was the role of climate resilient development pathways and interactions with mitigation and the health benefits of pursuing those pathways. So I want to outline what a climate resilient development pathway is first, so people understand what I'm referring to, and then also say a little bit about the concept of mitigation health co-benefits, which is a mouthful, but it's a pretty straightforward concept. And then I'll say a little bit about what's in the report about those things. So a climate resilient development pathway is essentially what it sounds like. It's a suite of development trajectories that in combination we expect will increase the resilience of a given country or location, community to climate change impacts. And that importantly includes both adaptation and mitigation activities. It includes attention to all of the other development issues and sustainable development goals that we inherit as part of our global equitable development agenda. So there are 7 things that are highlighted in the report as part of a climate resilient development pathway. The first is that a country fully implement the World Health Organization operational framework for building climate resilient health systems. We can go into that more specifically if you'd like during the Q&A. The second is achieving universal health coverage under SDG 3. The third is achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions from the healthcare sector, consistent with the Paris Agreement and with our goals of keeping dangerous climate change under 2 degrees. The fourth is fully achieving all of the SDGs. The fifth, adopting development that maximizes health co-benefits, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. The sixth, meeting objectives of the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. And as I mentioned, a lot of our chapter focused on human security and the changing structure of communities. And so there was a lot of emphasis on both internal or within state and then transboundary migration, which is expected to increase pretty substantially as the climate continues to change and sea levels rise. And then lastly, 7, incorporating inclusive and integrative approaches to promoting a climate resilient peace. So those are together a package, if you will, that that will confer increased resilience on a given community. And as I mentioned, one of the aspects of that is targeting development to maximize health co-benefits of mitigation activities. So mitigation, of course, is our policies and technologies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So rapid, aggressive, comprehensive movement toward renewable energy. And sustainable food systems and increased active transport as part of that. And as you might expect, most mitigation activities actually have almost immediate, really dramatic health benefits. And they come in multiple different pathways, depends on the mitigation activity that you're thinking about. But there are 3 major buckets. One is air pollution, reduced air pollution from combustion of fossil fuels. The second is changes in diet, eating lower on the food chain, a higher proportion of plants in the diet reduces the likelihood of cardiovascular disease and other related health conditions. And then, as I mentioned, increased physical activity improves cardiovascular fitness, reduces diabetes incidence, and all the rest. And all of that has lots of downstream and immediate, very substantial health benefits on a population basis. So in this report, a lot of evidence was gathered. This is not a new argument, but this argument was elaborated on and really nailed home, I think, in this report in a pretty effective way, because the evidence has matured over the last several cycles of these reports and highlighted that the expenditures for these mitigation activities are in most cases certainly offset, and in most cases actually completely offset by the health benefits associated, the value of the health benefits associated with these mitigation activities. The report also acknowledged some trade-offs, and this was I mean, it's always been there, but I think it was brought out a little more explicitly in this discourse, that we face some challenges. We have, our fossil fuel development is in many ways, even though there's significant health impacts associated with fossil fuel pollution, overall that development benefits health. And so there are trade-offs between moving more aggressively toward clean and renewable energy, moving away from cheaper fossil fuels, and poverty reduction. And poverty reduction, of course, is also good for health. So we have some trade-offs there, but it's very clear that investing in renewables and clean energy sources and equity throughout this process will have major health benefits. And they're mostly going to be seen actually through diet, and then secondarily through air pollution reductions, and then lastly through physical activity, excuse me. So with that, I'll pass the baton back to Kris.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that excellent summary. I'm Kris Ebi. I'm a professor in the Center for Health and the Global Environment, and had multiple roles in this report and have had multiple roles in previous reports. So as Jeremy said, if you've got questions about the process, I can certainly provide answers to those. I want to take just a couple of minutes, because we are starting to get questions in the Q&A, which is excellent, to talk about adaptation. The two main policy options for addressing climate change are adaptation and mitigation. And Jeremy talked with you about mitigation. And adaptation in public health is prevention. The term adaptation is what's used in the climate change community, but certainly in our community, we can just refer to it as prevention. It's being prepared. It's making sure that we've got the human financial resources, we've got the methods and tools, we have the understanding we need. One of the advantages our sector has in reference to other sectors in a changing climate is that all the health risks of a changing climate are current problems. There's policies and programs everywhere to address all the climate sensitive health outcomes. Not that a new one might not arise, but by and large, we're looking at significant exacerbations of current situations. And so that does put us in a good place in the sense that we have already worked on these issues, in some cases for well over 100 years. On the other hand, we haven't taken climate change explicitly into account. And that's where the challenge comes for the health sector, is putting climate change explicitly into our policies and programs. When we think about adaptation, we go to the risk-based framing that's been used with the IPCC for more than the last decade, where risk is the result of a combination of 4 basic factors. One are the hazards created by a changing climate. You heard about some of those. The second is the exposure of vulnerable peoples, of vulnerable regions. The third is the underlying vulnerability of these peoples in these places. And the fourth is the capacities to be able to manage. In health, we've had a tendency to conflate exposure and vulnerability, which is not useful. We really need to disentangle these very much. And then when we think about adaptation and you think about these 4 major factors, the real focus is on what is urgent and immediate that we need to do. And as you heard first from Gueladio, in many places, it's reducing that underlying vulnerability, providing access to water and sanitation systems, providing electrification. There's lots of basic development that needs to take place, and that is a first priority in adaptation. Another key priority in adaptation is building, as I think you heard from Sherilee, climate resilient and environmentally sustainable health systems. There's lots of progress in that space. A lot more needs to be made. For most countries, it starts with conducting vulnerability and adaptation assessments and then developing the health component of national adaptation plans. The major constraint is almost no investment. when you look at the investments under the adaptation funds, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it's running at about 0.5% of all the investment. There's even less investment in the research that needs to be done. As Anna mentioned, there's lots of gaps that need to be filled. So the major constraint we're facing is that investment. And we're really hoping that this report and all the findings in this report can really move forward with encouraging the investments that we need. And the final point I want to make is one that was raised by several of the panelists, is health is embedded within all of the other systems that we're talking about. We have to take systems-based approaches and make sure the choices made in agriculture don't have adverse consequences for health, unintentional or otherwise. It's all unintentional. And thinking about how we can work across all of the sectors to ensure that collectively we do build towards resilient and sustainable development as our climate continues to change and bring us even more challenges. And with that, we have all of 9 minutes. We've already got 3 questions, which is great. The first is Patrick, which is really about taking these systems-based approaches and being able to do more holistic research. It's an excellent point, Patrick. I'm sure all of us would be delighted to have a research structure in the US where we could look at issues jointly with other scientific disciplines. You're right, it's urgently needed, and it's not there at the moment, but we hope with the changes being made in the federal agencies in the US that we might make progress in that area. Does anybody want to add to that? And then the second question is from Sam. Thank you, Sam, for joining. Sam was a postdoc with us for a couple of years. Of what exactly are the new insights? There's quite a few new insights that have not yet been mentioned. I'm sure that Sheri can talk about mental health. There was a lot that came out on mental health. There's other new insights. So I open it to everybody else to start jumping in on the first 2 questions.
I can jump in on the second one, and I'll be really succinct, so there's lots of time for other people to talk. I would say some of the new key messages are that the impacts are happening faster, more widespread, and more severe than we thought in AR5. I would say that there's more coverage of adaptation gaps and finance in AR6 than there was in AR5. Colonialism is explicitly mentioned in the SPM of AR6, which I think is huge. Indigenous knowledge has a much better treatment throughout the report. Still more work needs to be done, but I'd say that that's an important advancement. And then, as Kris already mentioned, a thorough assessment of mental health has been done for the first time.
And Sheri, loss and damage got much greater coverage, significantly greater coverage than it did before. Anybody else? Jeremy, you have to take yourself off mute.
Darn, thanks. I'll just add one other thing, and that is that the scope of the health chapter changed with this report. It was no longer just health. It was health, human security, changing structure of communities. It was very challenging as an author on that report to synthesize all of that evidence. I think everybody on the chapter recognized the need for that and the rationale for it, and the congruence with a social determinants of health framework. But there actually is not a lot of evidence that integrates all of those considerations. And so we struggled with a framework for presenting all of this evidence and synthesizing it in the report. And so that was a new challenge for us. I think we did our best. We struggled. I hope that with the next report that some frameworks will come together that are more mature and allow for an even greater sort of combination of evidence in that space.
So I would like to say something about the first question where the person talked about the heat and water matters, how they are linked. And the question is really relevant because in many regions, like for instance, in the Sahelian band, the dry season is also where you have the highest temperatures. So it's when the people are starting to see the rivers drying up and the water in some wells is no more available, is that drying out, that again, they are facing extreme temperatures. So there's kind of compounding risk on the head of people in those regions. So yes, it's warranting more research. It's on those regions that are really poor, that are really having some other economic and social challenges that we are lacking studies. As this has also been said in the report, that we are in more on need again of researchers in regions that we know are the ones having the maximum of hazards and impacts on their heads. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got about 4 minutes left. I was going to take a quick response to Brenda's question. I think the next question really is about developing national adaptation plans. But then if somebody wants to talk about social protection and malnutrition. So Brenda, I have a slightly different take on your question. It's about misinformation. One of the absolute privileges is being able to be present during the Summary for Policymaker approval session. And this is where countries go literally word by word and line by line through the Summary for Policymakers. It took 2 weeks because we did it virtually, which made it a lot harder. But it's absolutely fascinating that as you go through this, a sentence comes up and a country says, in this chapter, in this paragraph, on this page, on this line number, you say X. That's really important for my country. And I'd like to see that sentence moved into the Summary for Policymakers. That the focal points come in, having read the entire report in detail, having understood where all of the sentences come from in the Summary for Policymakers, and most of them come in really wanting to strengthen those so that they could use these at the national level to make sure that they communicate clearly about the risks we're facing and what we know about what can be done. So you can step back and think about how this report can then be used to counter the misinformation that's going on, particularly in the US and a few other countries. But mostly the countries are just really committed to making sure that this information is not only scientifically valid, but is useful and clear and understandable. Somebody want to talk about social protection, and I'll type an answer about the strategies for adaptation mitigation.
Maybe on strategies for low-income regions or countries with regard to mitigation and adaptation. I think the strategy is general. It's how they can have a kind of multiple strategy towards sources of funding. Their own local resources are very low, but also the opportunities given by the multilateral funds is calling upon capacities in building the proposals, following up the proposal, and even if the proposal is gone through, how you can implement it. So there is a large, strong component of capacity building and capacitating strategies that should be following or targeting the low-income regions or countries. That is the first thing that I see as necessary, is how to really make countries able to submit proposals and to have the capacity of implementing even when they get the funds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We clearly could go on a whole lot longer, but we've got 1 minute to go, and I want to turn it back to Jeremy to provide some closing comments and to thank all of the panelists and to thank all of the participants. Jeremy. You're on mute still.
I'll never learn. 2.5 years. Well, I want to first say that I typed in a response to one of the last questions about mitigation and health co-benefits for frontline communities. It's an important thing that we're learning a lot about here on the West Coast of late. But overall, I want to say thank you. Thanks to everyone for your attendance, your interest. Thanks to all the panelists for your insights and for your contributions to the report over these last several trying years. It's meant a lot to me, so I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. We look forward to seeing you next time.
And thanks to Gueladio and Anna for staying up so very late to do this. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mhm. Okay, bye-bye.
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 Pleasure, thank you.